bet you're wondering how I got here in this situation. Well, I have to cover Aries Operations 3 Task B, which is going over cross-country flight planning, in order to keep my A for this class. Even though I scored a 96 on the knowledge test, I still have to do these assignments. Because for some reason this just absolutely tanks my grade if I don't do this assignment. It's alright though, because I'm actually an expert at teaching cross-country flight planning for instrument flight. You might be saying, how are you an expert? Well, it's because I got myself a easy PowerPoint here that I can easily just talk about for the next 10 minutes, and I don't even gotta worry about anything. I don't got no billboard. I mean, usually I would have the projector, you know, that thing that I was talking about the last lesson plan, or having it projected up for me, but this time I'm just gonna talk and yap for the next 10 minutes. But I know you can understand me, don't worry about it. Okay, so in the Federal Aviation Regulations, part 61, 65, it goes over, you know, the things you need for an instrument rating requirements. And one of those is that you have to do this flight of 250 nautical miles, which has to have at least 3 instrument approaches, 3 different kinds of instruments approaches. It's just a big old, you know, cross-country, very famous one that you must do no matter what if you want to get your instrument rating. And so we're going to kind of base off of our cross-country based off of that, because you have to do that cross-country for your instrument flight plan, and we are instrument students now. So that's why we're doing this, that's why we're learning about this, because even though you were a private pilot and you're like, oh, brother, I gotta learn more about cross-country, I don't want to do nav long, don't worry. You still kind of gotta do your nav long, still gotta know your fuel requirements, which we'll go into. This one, we're just a little bit adding a little bit more on what you already know, if not a refresher, right? And so just how we're talking about like the things that you have to do before private pilot, there's like safety checklists we like to do, and the PAVE is one of them. You know, for one pilot, right, you still have to do your I'm safe checklist, you know, making sure that everything's all good. You have to get your licenses, make sure all your docs are good, make sure you as an individual are current. Well, speaking of currencies, there's some new currencies that you have to add, but we'll skip that because we're going into cross-country flight planning. But that's a cool little fact. And then, you know, at the end of the day, you have to do your risk assessment matrix. That's, you know, that's one of the tools that you're given in which to determine the risk probability. And then at the end of the day, 91.3, you are responsibility and authority, and you are the pilot in command of those operations. So essentially, you get to say whether it's a go or no go decision. That's the most key indicator to remember when you're doing these cross-country flight plans. You don't want to have a get there itis mentality and just like, all right, let's get there no matter what. And also, you know, before you do the cross-country flight plan, you also have to make sure that you know, your aircraft's good to go. And so you have to, I'm sure you've heard the acronyms aviated, right? And that's, are the inspections required, and you know, you have to do your annual. But now, you know, even though they mentioned it before, there's the VOR, the 100-hour terminator static, you know, of course he says do the 100-hour before because that's required for paid or instructions, but the VOR is more or less, now that's actually a part of requirement because we're doing instrument flight, and we're actually relying upon the VOR. Same thing with the altimeter / statics, needing controller space, and needing for IFR use. We're relying upon those instruments now, you know, as we're doing instrument flights, because in instrument flight, we're relying upon our instruments. All right, aircraft, once again, we're going over those were inspections required. We still have to go to our equipment requirements, and then we kind of have to do like a flight deck check, but we're going to skip that because it's a whole nother lesson plan. But, you know, you probably hear the acronym GRAB card. That's where that's kind of associated at. And then, you know, we're still going down that PAVE checklist. Pilots, we just talked about. Aircraft, we just talked about. Now we're going to environment. You have to get your flight service stations, and still have to clock the 100 weather briefing, get the information from the from Full Flight, which gets it from NOAA, and you still got to get your weather, still got to know that stuff, still got to keep refreshed on that stuff. We're looking at 5 minutes here on the clock, roughly, so I got to make sure that I keep going through this stuff. And then E external factor is kind of already brushed up on that. We're just going to go back that. So, for this flight plan, I'm going to show you what this PowerPoint looks like. You know, I'm going to give you a little teaser, right? And so I have kind of like this. I'm not sure if you can see it. I'm just trusting that you can see it. We're going from KBFL to Fresno to Santa Maria to Bakersfield. And I have some little images there to keep the, you know, flight, to keep the PowerPoint interesting. And those are the 3 points that I was talking about, and we'll do the 3 different approaches. One at Fresno, one at Santa Maria, one at Bakersfield, and we have to select different approaches for there. Remember, we still got to do our pre-flight action 91.103. There's new fuel requirements, which you can look into 91.167. There's the alternates, whether or not you need an alternate, 91.169, which goes into that details. And then also we have to, now there's new altitudes that we picked, looking at 91.179, but it's basically the same thing. We're just not adding the 500 that we usually do. Filing. I gave a quick little tutorial in my PowerPoint here, which tells you a step-by-step process. But if you had your FliRT, we can just pull it out. But it's not just FliRT in which you can do the flight plan. You can also do it at 1-800. You can also do it at 1-800 weather briefing, and Jeppesen as well. And yeah, and then you gotta put it on your G1000. Gotta do it again. There you go. Gotta put it into your G1000, and we would talk about that once we're actually in the aircraft and how to do that. And you gotta get your craft clearance, and then once you go, you can depart. And then we're looking at our charts. But remember, this is cross-country flight planning, so we're not going to talk about that too much. But you still have to pick your departures, and you have to put that into your flight plan. And then once you pick your departure, then you're going to start using these nav aids. And there's really 2 things that you're going to have to really talk about. One, nav aids are just like VORs, and there's all sorts of different VORs, but those are kind of nav aids to use. And then these VORs, that's when you go into Victor Airways and GPS routes. And then Victor Airways are based off of those nav aids, those VORs, and they look a little something like this. They got that little V on them, right? And then GPS routes got that blue on them. And you also saw some fixes there too, and there's also waypoints, and then waypoints are GPS based. So basically you're kind of just balancing in between VORs and GPS. And then VORs are ground stations, GPS are where we're getting that information from those satellites. And then there's a whole nother lesson going into how they work. And then there's a whole bunch of symbology, and then you can go pull up charts that talk about all the different symbology. That's a whole nother chart, that's a whole nother process and stuff. But essentially when you're making this flight plan, you want to making sure that you have the most direct route, making sure you clear up obstacles, and so that you're making sure you know about your MEA, AROCA, a minimum, MCA, all those different acronyms. MEA, MDA, MCA, MOCA, AROCA, MRA, a whole bunch of acronyms you have to go into, you have to know about, and a whole bunch of symbologies. And you still have to, if you see a green airport, what does that mean? If you see a brown airport, what does that mean? And that's important to know, because you're like, let me put this airport from my flight plan. Well, that airport doesn't have approaches, and that's not a good thing. So that's why it's important to know that symbology, because if you're making those flight plans and you're flying in instrument conditions, you don't want to be flying into an airport that doesn't have any approaches, and then you're like, well, this didn't work. Or I guess more like the case scenario, you pull up to your instructor with this flight plan made, and you're like, okay, we're going from here, 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 and your instructor's like, this place doesn't have any approaches, and you use that as your alternate, and then you didn't meet the requirements, and then he's like, you didn't study, and then you gotta go back, and then you gotta do it all over again. So you gotta make sure you all know this stuff, and so you don't get embarrassed, and stay on your guard. And then there's DAs, MDAs, we're talking about approaches. There's a whole bunch of different departures too. Basically, it goes from the departure, en route, stars, but that's kind of like airliner stuff when you go into higher enough altitudes, and then approaches, and then you land, and that is your flight plan. Pretty simple, pretty easy. Kind of explain why it's important. And now I have 30 seconds to burn. And what else do I gotta talk about? We'll probably talk about the different kinds of approaches to different kinds of departures. I hope you guys have an amazing week 10. I hope your studying goes right. I hope everything goes great for you. And me trying to stall for the next 10 seconds so I can meet the 10-minute requirement. Yeah, and that's it. See ya.